The child had not spoken in 4 months. Not to the specialists who drove up from Toronto with their folders and their careful suggestions. Not to the grief counselor who came every Thursday and sat across from her in the sunroom and waited with professional patience. Not to her grandfather, who had built half of Mississauga's East End and who stood in the doorway of her bedroom some evenings just holding the frame, not knowing what else to do with his hands. Isla Cole did not speak because there was nothing left inside her that felt like words. She was 9 years old. Her mother had died in February, on a Tuesday, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Since then, she had moved through the house like weather, present affecting everything, impossible to hold. Her father, Declan Cole, had tried everything he knew how to try. He had taken a leave from his company. He had hired 3 different nannies in as many months. He had read articles and made appointments and sat on the edge of her bed at night, reading her books she used to love. And she had listened with her eyes open and her face turned toward the wall. And he had kept reading anyway because stopping felt like giving up. The third nanny left on a Wednesday without notice. She left a note on the kitchen counter that said she was sorry, that she wasn't equipped, that she hoped Isla would find her way. Declan stood in the kitchen reading the note for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer where they kept takeout menus and rubber bands and things that didn't have anywhere else to go. He called the agency that afternoon. They said they had someone. They said she was experienced with children who had experienced loss. They said her name was Lena Osei, and she was available to start Monday. Declan said, "Fine," he said Monday. He hung up and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard, at the swing set that nobody had touched since winter, at the grass coming up green and indifferent, and he thought that he would try anything. He had been thinking that for 4 months. He was still not sure it was working. Lena Osei arrived on Monday at 8 in the morning with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a tin of biscuits she'd made herself the night before. She was 41 years old, though she had one of those faces that seemed to belong to several ages at once. Young when she smiled, older when she was thinking. She wore her hair natural, pulled back loosely, and she had a quality of stillness about her that was not coldness. It was the kind of stillness that comes from having learned, somewhere along the way, that panic does not help. Declan met her at the door in a shirt he hadn't ironed. He shook her hand and showed her around the house in the distracted way of a man who had too many things in his head to give his full attention to any of them. He pointed out where things were kept. He said Isla was upstairs. He said Isla didn't talk much at the moment. He said it in the way people say things they have practiced, saying so many times that the words have lost their weight. Lena listened. She did not offer anything in response except a small nod that seemed to say she had heard him, and that she had understood more than he'd said. When he was done, she asked if she could go up and introduce herself. He said yes. Then he stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened, and he heard nothing unusual. No voices, no doors, no sounds of anything going wrong. And after a few minutes he went to his office and tried to work, which he had not been able to do with any real focus since February. Upstairs, Lena stood in the doorway of Isla's room and took it in without entering. The room was tidy in a way that felt wrong for a 9-year-old. The stuffed animals were arranged on a shelf with too much precision. The books were stacked by height. There was a drawing on the desk, unfinished, a garden of some kind, flowers that had been started and then left, and the colored pencils were capped and lined up beside it. Isla sat on the floor by the window, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and a book open across her lap. She was not reading. She was looking out the window at the tree in the backyard, the one with the branch that grew at a strange sideways angle, the one that had always looked to Declan like it was reaching for something just out of its reach. She did not look up when Lena appeared in the doorway. Lena did not say hello. She did not say her name, or explain who she was, or offer any of the practiced introductions she had used over the years with children who were suffering. She looked at the room for a moment, and then she looked at the tree the child was looking at, and then she sat down on the floor just inside the doorway. Not close, not intrusive, just present, and she opened her own bag and took out a small sketchbook and a pencil, and she began to draw. She drew the tree, the one outside the window, the one with the sideways branch. She drew it slowly, looking up at it between strokes, the way someone does when they are actually paying attention. Isla's eyes moved from the window to Lena, then back to the window, then back to Lena again. Lena kept drawing. After perhaps 10 minutes, she held up the sketchbook toward the window, comparing it to the tree, and tilted her head slightly because the branch wasn't right yet. From across the room, without moving from her spot against the wall, Isla watched. Lena erased a line, drew it again, a little lower. Then she turned the sketchbook around so Isla could see it, if she wanted to look. Isla looked. She looked at the drawing for a long time without expression, and then, very slowly, she got up from her spot on the floor, and crossed the room, and stood in front of Lena, and looked at the drawing from close up. Lena held it steady for her. Isla pointed at the branch, the sideways one. Lena offered her the pencil, and Isla took it. Declan did not know about the pencil until days later. He was not the kind of man who eavesdropped on his own household. Or he told himself that. The truth was more complicated. He had been watching. Not intrusively, not with cameras or monitoring software, nothing like that. But he had been watching in the way a person watches when they are afraid and have nothing else they can do. From the edges, from the corner of the eye, from the kind of careful distance that lets you see without being seen. He noticed that Isla began coming downstairs for breakfast again, which she had not done since early March. He noticed that she came down before Lena arrived. She had not been coming down before anyone arrived in a very long time. He noticed that she waited. He did not know what to do with this information. He put it alongside the other things he had noticed, and was not sure how to interpret. The drawing on Isla's desk that had been completed, the flowers finished in green and yellow, the half-eaten biscuit on the windowsill in the sunroom, the way the stuffed animals on the shelf had been rearranged into something that looked less like a display and more like a pile. He was going over contracts in his home office on a Thursday afternoon when he heard it. He heard something from the kitchen. A sound. Not quite a word, but something in that direction. A shape of a sound, an attempt at one. Then Lena's voice, low and unhurried, saying something he couldn't make out. Then silence. Then again the sound. He did not move from his desk. He sat very still, and he did not breathe in any useful way, and he listened. And after a moment he heard it more clearly. It was a word. Just one word, spoken very quietly, the way someone speaks who is not sure yet if words are safe. The word was again. He heard it, because Lena had been reading to Isla from a book, a chapter book about a girl who travels to different countries and brings back one object from each place. And she had paused at the end of a chapter, and Isla had said again, which meant she wanted Lena to keep going. It was the first word Declan had heard from his daughter in 4 months. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and he breathed through it very carefully, the way you breathe through something enormous when you are trying not to make a sound. He did not go into the kitchen. He did not tell Isla he had heard. He did not tell Lena either, not that day, because the moment felt too delicate to touch. But he sat there for a long time after the reading had ended and the kitchen had gone quiet. And something in the architecture of his chest shifted in a way that it had not shifted since February, and he did not have a word for what it was except that it was not grief. Or not only grief, it was something adjacent to hope, which had been a very long time coming. He started watching more deliberately after that. Not because he doubted her. That was important. He was clear with himself about that. He had no particular reason to doubt Lena Osei. She came when she said she would come. She stayed until the agreed time. She left the kitchen tidy. She brought things, small things, books and pencils, and occasionally food she had made, without making a production of it. She did not treat Isla's silence as a problem to be fixed. She treated it as weather, something to work with rather than against. He watched because he did not know how else to be close to something that was happening without him. He was a man who had built things. He had started his first company, at 24, in a rented office in Hamilton with two people he'd met in university, and a business plan that had three different versions depending on which investor he was pitching. He had grown it. He had made decisions under pressure, in rooms where the stakes were significant, and the margin for error was small. He knew how to act. He knew how to push. He did not know how to stand still while his daughter healed. He did not know how to trust that process to someone else. So he watched, because watching felt like the closest thing to participating that was available to him. He started taking his lunch to the back porch, on the days when Lena took Isla outside. He sat at the table back there with his laptop and his sandwich and his pretense of working. They did not go near the back porch. They went to the front yard or the side garden, or, increasingly, for walks in the neighborhood. But it gave him a reason to be outside. It gave him something to do with his body while the other thing was happening. One afternoon in late May, he came home earlier than expected. He had a call that canceled and he couldn't face the office anymore. So he drove home and parked in the front and walked up the path, and through the front window, he saw Lena and Isla sitting at the kitchen table. Isla had a plate in front of her. They were making something. He could see the flour on the table, a dusting of it, a small heap of mess that was entirely unlike the careful arrangements Isla had been making of her belongings for months. Isla had flour on her sleeve. She was looking down at whatever she was making, and her face was not blank. Her face had something in it. A furrow of concentration. A small, fighting against itself, almost smile. Declan stood on the front path and did not go inside. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, in the cool air, just watching. Lena said something. He couldn't hear through the glass. Isla looked up at her, and Lena pointed at something on Isla's side of the table. And Isla looked at it, and then she laughed. It was a small laugh, barely audible. It disappeared almost before it arrived, but it was there. Declan turned around and walked back down the path. He sat in his car in the driveway for several minutes, with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the middle distance. Then he put his head down on the wheel, very briefly, and breathed. He was not going to cry in his own driveway in broad daylight. He breathed for another moment, and then he straightened up, and he got out of the car and went inside. He went in through the back. He made noise coming through the door, so they would hear him. By the time he reached the kitchen, Isla was still at the table, but her face had returned to something more closed, the way it went when he was around. Not unkind, just careful. And Lena was at the counter washing something, and everything looked ordinary. "Hey," he said. Isla did not respond, but she also did not leave the room. He took that. He began thinking about Lena Osei in ways he had not expected and was not entirely prepared for. He thought about her at night, which was inconvenient. He thought about the way she had answered him one morning when he asked how she thought Isla was doing. Not with the professional summary he had expected, the reassuring language of someone reporting to an employer. But honestly, with pauses in it, with the kind of considered uncertainty that people use when they are taking a question seriously. She had said, "I think she's starting to remember that the world is still here." And then she had thought about it for another moment and said, "I don't think she's ready to want that yet, but she's starting to remember it." He had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for longer than was probably appropriate. She had not seemed to notice, or if she had not flagged it. He thought about the tin of biscuits she still brought, every Monday, without comment. He thought about the sketchbook she kept in her bag. He thought about the fact that she had spent 40 minutes one afternoon helping Isla write a letter to the grief counselor explaining, in Isla's careful printed letters, that she didn't want to come on Thursdays anymore, that she would rather have the time with Lena. She had not told Declan this was happening. She had helped Isla compose it and then left it on the kitchen table for him, and at the bottom of the letter, in smaller letters, Lena had added, "She wrote this herself. I only helped with spelling." He did not know what to do with any of this. He was her employer. She worked in his house. There were several obvious reasons why what he was feeling was not something he was going to act on. He cataloged these reasons carefully, and they remained reasonable and he continued thinking about her at night anyway. The conversation happened on a Friday. It was mid-June. Isla had gone up to her room after dinner. She was eating dinner, with Declan now, 3 or 4 times a week, sitting at the table and occasionally pointing at things she wanted passed to her. Occasionally, with effort, using a word or two. And Lena was gathering her things to leave. Declan was in the kitchen. He had been in the kitchen on some pretext to do with dishes. He was aware that the pretext was thin. Lena came in from the hallway and said, "She asked me today if we could go to the conservation area next week." He turned from the counter. "She asked you?" "She left me a note." Lena said it without emphasis, but there was something in her expression, not pride exactly, something quieter. Satisfaction, maybe. The kind that comes from watching something go right. "A note," he repeated. "On the kitchen table this morning." She held up her bag to show she was about to leave and then didn't leave. She tilted her head slightly and looked at him in that way she had, assessing, careful, not unkind. "You're doing well with her, you know. She talks about you." He was caught off guard by this. "She doesn't. She barely. She writes." Lena met his eyes steadily. "We've been writing back and forth. She said you read to her every night. She said you make terrible pancakes, but you try every Saturday." He felt something in his face that he hoped was not too obvious. "They've been improving." She mentioned that too. A small pause. "She's not as far away as she looks." He did not know what to say. He had been a person who always knew what to say, in boardrooms, in pitch meetings, across tables from people who were trying to take things from him. Language was a tool he knew how to use. Right now it felt entirely unavailable. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She waited. He said, "Why do you do this?" She considered the question without hurrying. "Do what?" "This, the way you do it." He gestured, vaguely, at the kitchen, at the house, at everything. "You bring things. You stay late sometimes. The letter to the therapist. Nobody asked you to help her write that." Lena put her bag down on the chair and thought for a moment. "I grew up in Brampton," she said. "On the east side, the part that gets cold in a particular way in winter. My mother worked 2 jobs and my father worked 1.5, and we had a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was retired and who brought food when things were hard and sat with me when I was little and my parents weren't home." She paused. "I used to think she was just being kind. Later I understood that she saw something that needed doing. And she did it, not because anyone asked her, because it was there." She looked at him then, directly, in the way she had that he was still not used to. Isla needed someone to sit with her. That's all. Anyone would do the same. "No," he said. "They wouldn't." She looked at him for a moment. She did not argue with him. She said, "I'm going to be late," he said. "Right. Yes, sorry." She picked up her bag. At the door, she paused and turned. "The conservation area is good. Lots of open space. Room to breathe." She looked at him. "You should come." He opened his mouth to say something about his schedule, about the things he had that week, about the reasons he probably shouldn't be spending his Saturday at the conservation area with the woman he employed. None of these things came out. He said, "Okay." She left. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, with his hands in his pockets, and the evening coming in through the window, and something in the room that had changed imperceptibly. The way rooms do when a person who belongs in them has just been in them. The conservation area was 45 minutes north of the city, past the exit for the ski hills, up into the part of Ontario where the rock starts showing through the ground and the trees get older and the sky somehow gets wider. They took Declan's car. Isla sat in the back with her window cracked and her face turned toward the passing landscape. Lena sat in the front with her sketchbook on her lap and looked out at the same landscape from the other side. Declan drove. Nobody spoke for most of the drive, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. At one point, Isla tapped the window with one finger. Declan looked in the rearview mirror, and Isla was pointing at something. A hawk sitting on a fence post at the side of the road, completely still, watching the field. "Good eye," Lena said, without turning around. Isla pressed her face closer to the glass to watch it, until the fence curved away. They parked near the trailhead and walked. The trail curved through birch and cedar and down to the lake, which was very blue and very still in the morning air. The water was high from the spring thaw. Somebody had left a row of flat stones along the bank, and Isla went straight to them and began rearranging them. Lena sat down on a log near the bank and opened her sketchbook. Declan stood for a moment looking at the lake and then sat down near her. Not intrusively near, but near enough that they were both in the same general vicinity of the water. For a while neither of them said anything. "She looks lighter," he said finally. Lena looked up. Isla was still at the stones, precise and absorbed, making something. "Yes, since February she's been. I couldn't reach her." He paused. He was not a man who said things like this often. "I kept trying different things and nothing worked, and I started to think maybe I wasn't going to be able to fix it. That it was just going to be like that." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, the worst part about grief for children isn't that they don't know how to handle it. It's that everyone around them is also grieving and doing it out loud, and the child thinks they need to be smaller about theirs so there's room for everyone else's." She looked at Isla. Isla didn't stop talking because she was broken. She stopped because she was taking up less space. He looked at his daughter at the water's edge, her small hands moving the stones, her face turned downward in intent. "You gave her space," Lena said. "You kept showing up. That matters more than you know." He looked at Lena then, directly, for perhaps longer than he'd allowed himself before. She was looking at Isla, not at him. There was something in her profile that he could only describe Spot as trustworthy. Not in the corporate sense, not as a quality to be verified by reference check, but in the older sense. The sense that meant, this person means what she says and does what she means. He had not been around very many people who worked that way. He said, "Can I tell you something?" She looked at him. "I've been." He stopped. Restarted. "I've been trying to find a reason to disapprove of you. Since you started. I've been watching very carefully and looking for evidence that something is wrong, because something has always been wrong with every other arrangement we've tried." She raised an eyebrow. Not offended. Just watching. "And I haven't found anything," he said, which I realize sounds like a backhanded thing to say. "It does," she agreed. "I mean it as the opposite." He held her gaze. "I mean it as, you're the first person who has made her feel safe, and I don't know why it works, and I'm a person who needs to understand why things work." He paused. "I think about it a great deal." She looked at him for a moment, with that particular quality of attention she had. Fully present, evaluating, taking him seriously, without inflating anything. "You're going to have to say what you actually mean," she said. "Because I'm not going to fill in the blanks for you," he said. "I know. I know that about you already," he breathed. "I think I've been working up to asking you something for several weeks, and I'm not sure this is the right time or the right place." "It isn't," she said. He paused. "But go ahead," she added. He almost smiled. He said, "Would you be willing to have dinner with me?" "Not as," he gestured vaguely, "not as this, as something else." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Down at the water, Isla had finished her arrangement of stones and was now sitting on a large flat rock with her feet in the water, her face turned up toward the sky. "I like working here," Lena said carefully. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what's complicated about what you're asking. I'm aware of it too. I'm not someone who bends because it's convenient," she said. "I come from a place where you learned quickly that bending for convenience just makes you easier to push the rest of the way over. If you're asking because you think I'm impressive and you want to know me better, that's one thing. If you're asking because you're lonely and I'm available, I'd rather you not." He said, "It's the first thing." She looked at him. He held the look. "Dinner," she said. "One dinner. And I am going to need you to make a significant effort," he said. "I will." From the water's edge, without looking up from the sky she was watching, Isla said, quietly, but audibly, "Good." Both of them turned to look at her. Isla was still looking at the sky, but there was something around the edges of her mouth. Lena looked at Declan. Declan looked at Lena. Declan looked at Lena. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. He made a significant effort. He researched restaurants the way he researched acquisitions. Methodically, with multiple sources, with particular attention to detail. He booked somewhere on Ossington that had been written about in Toronto Life 6 months ago, and that had a small room in the back, quieter, less performative than the front. He told Lena where they were going, and she said nothing, which he had learned meant she approved. He picked her up from her apartment in Scarborough. This felt important. Not to send a car, not to meet her there, but to go and get her, the way his father had always said a person should. Her building was a mid-rise on a street, with a good bakery and a community garden at the end of it, and several kids who appeared to be playing some complicated variant of basketball. She came out of the building in a dark green dress and earrings he hadn't seen before, and she looked at him when she got in the car and said, "You cleaned it," he said. "Of course I cleaned it," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd know how." He said, "I have a lot of hidden competencies." She laughed, actually laughed, full and unguarded, and he felt it the way you feel something you have been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting. They talked for 4 hours. He had expected it to be careful and slightly effortful, the way first dates often are. It was not. She talked about growing up in Brampton, the East Side, the particular texture of that neighborhood in the 90s, her mother's cooking, the women at their church who had known her name since before she could say it herself. She talked about her first job at 16, working behind the counter of a dry cleaner's, and the owner, an older Jamaican woman named Mrs. Fraser, who had told her, "The world will try to convince you that small work is beneath you. Don't believe it. Nothing that needs doing is beneath you." He talked about Hamilton, about his father who had worked for the city for 30 years, and who had come to every single one of his school presentations, even when they were terrible, and especially when they were terrible. He talked about the first company he'd built, the offices in Hamilton, the way it had felt to make something from very little. He talked about Isla's mother, not easily, but honestly, in the way he'd had to learn to talk about her. And Lena listened to that with her full attention, the way she listened to everything, which was not performatively, and not with the slightly adjusted expression people sometimes got when they felt they needed to manage the topic. She just listened. At the end of the evening she said, "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she said. "I'm not sure. Probably someone who needed to be right about things more than you do." He thought about this. "I do need to be right about things. You need to understand things," she said. "That's different. Needing to be right means you've decided before you look. You look first. That's rarer." He held that. Then he said, "You see people very clearly. I grew up having to," she said simply. He took her home. Outside her building, in the car, he said, "I'd like to do this again," she said. "I know you would," he said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile but contained a smile inside it, the way certain things contain other things. "It's a yes," she said. He walked her to her door, which she did not expect, and they stood on the step for a moment in the June night, with the sounds of the neighborhood around them. He said good night. She said good night. He did not try for more than that. He drove home thinking about nothing but her, which he was becoming accustomed to, and which he no longer considered inconvenient. There were 3 more dinners, and then a Sunday where they took Isla to a botanical garden and walked through the rose section, while Isla filled 3 pages of a new sketchbook, and then a Wednesday evening in the kitchen, where Declan was attempting a risotto with middling success, and Lena sat at the counter and offered corrections with a composure that he found both infuriating and excellent. And he burned the bottom of the pot, and she replaced him at the stove without ceremony and finished it. And they ate it at the kitchen table, with the windows open to the early evening, and it was the best thing he had eaten in a year. He had been thinking about things for a while by this point, thinking about them in the careful, methodical, several times over way he thought about important decisions. He had been patient with himself. He had not wanted to rush. The decision had been made, without his full awareness, the afternoon in the conservation area. Everything since had been the part that comes after a decision, the working out, the preparation, the learning the shape of what you already know you want. He thought about the right moment. He thought about it the way he thought about the right moment for anything consequential. You do not wait for perfect conditions, but you also do not move before you are steady, before the ground under you is what it needs to be. The ground was what it needed to be. It was a Saturday in July. They were in the backyard, the three of them, which had become a thing that happened naturally now, without engineering. Isla had claimed the spot near the garden beds and was doing something with seed packets and a small hand trowel that Lena had brought weeks ago, and that had since become a permanent installation in the shed. The summer had been warm, and the tomatoes were coming up, and the yard smelled like green things in the heat of the afternoon. Declan was at the table on the back porch, not pretending to work, not pretending to anything. Lena was next to him with a glass of iced tea and her sketchbook, and her particular quality of easy presence that still moved him every time he let himself notice it. He said, "There's something I want to ask you." She looked at him. She had learned his rhythms over the months. She knew what "there's something I want to ask you" sounded like when it was an easy question and when it was not. She set down her glass. He said, "I'm not going to do this inadequately. I want to be clear about that," she said. "Okay. I've thought about this carefully. I've thought about what you said, about not bending for convenience, about knowing why someone is asking. I want you to know that I know why I'm asking." He looked at her steadily. "I want to build something with you. Not because I'm lonely and you're available. Not because you're good for Isla, though you are. Because of who you are. Because of the way you talk to people. Because of the way you sit in a room and make it feel less like the world is ending." A pause. "Because you're the most honest person I've been near in a very long time, and I didn't know how much I needed that until I found it." She held his gaze through all of this. Her expression was composed. He could not read it as well as he could read most things, which was one of the things he found most remarkable about her. He said, "I'm asking if you'll marry me." The yard was quiet around them. The sound of Isla's trowel working the soil. A bird somewhere in the cedar at the fence. The afternoon light moving slowly across the garden. Lena looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I need you to understand that I come with things. History. A way of being in the world that isn't always easy. I know. I have strong opinions about a significant number of topics. I've noticed. I will always be honest with you. Even when it is not what you want to hear. Especially then. That's the part I need most." She was quiet for another moment. She looked at the garden, at Isla at her back, at the small shoulder blades working as she dug, at the tomatoes coming up, at the yard, with its swing set and its cedar and its sideways branching tree visible from the upstairs window. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and direct. The way she was, the way everything she said was. "Yes." From the garden, without turning around, Isla said. Finally, they both looked at her. She did not look up from her tomatoes, but the set of her small shoulders had changed. There was something in them that was new, or that had been returning slowly over months, and was now, in this moment, fully back. A kind of ease, a kind of rightness, a belonging in a body that had not felt like belonging for a long time. Lena looked at Declan. He looked at Lena. The afternoon held all three of them in it, in the warm and ordinary summer air, and the garden went on growing around them the way gardens do. Patient and indifferent to dramatic moments, concerned only with light and water and the slow, reliable business of becoming.